So we're going to be reviewing the different types of cellular transport in this. And even though this has a lot to do with the plasma membrane and has a lot to do with these different proteins that we're going to be looking at, those are actually in different review videos. So if you're confused about the structure of the plasma membrane or the different proteins that the plasma membrane uses, those are in some earlier review videos that you want to make sure you go back and watch and to try to understand. All right, so let's take a look at this image here. What you should do is pause the image and see if you can actually run through and kind of name what's going on in these different boxes before I go through it. So kind of challenge yourself to practice going through this first before I go through everything. All right, so let's go through this. When we're taking a look at the plasma membrane, we need to remember we have this charged part here on the outsides and the middle is not charged. We also have some terms we need to remember. We need to remember that the outside of the cell, which is everything up here, is called the extracellular space, and everything inside the cell is called the intracellular space. All right, so we have two major types of transport, or ways that the cell can move things across. And before we get too far, let's remember, cells have to move things across because they want to maintain homeostasis. So if they have too much oxygen, they get rid of it. Or if they don't have enough oxygen, they bring some in. Same thing with CO2, same thing with waste, anything. They need to maintain homeostasis. Every single cell does this. All right, so two types. We have passive and active. And the primary difference between these two is that passive does not require energy and active does. Active requires energy in the form of ATP. Remember, that's the major energy that cell uses, that all cells use. Let's focus on passive. In our first form of passive, we're taking a look at very small particles that are not charged. We call those nonpolar. And you notice that they move right through the plasma membrane. Okay, these can be things like oxygen or CO2. Now, when they move through, they always go through, in this situation, from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And because that movement is called diffusion. So this is known as simple diffusion because it goes right through the membrane. All right, in our next situation here, here we take a look at simple diffusion going on right through the membrane. Perfect. In our next situation, we're dealing with larger or polar molecules. This could be glucose, or it could be something like a sodium ion. Remember, ion means charged. And because of that, they cannot pass straight through. They're still going from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So it's still diffusion. And remember, diffusion happens naturally without energy. But in order to get through the membrane, they have to use a helper. In this case, the helper is called a protein. So when you use a helper, it's called facilitated diffusion. The word facilitated actually means help. All right, next one here is water. Water does not play well with these hydrophobic tails, so they use a special protein called an aquaporin to get through. And they're still going from high to low concentration, so it's passive transport, no energy needed. And we know the movement of water is called osmosis. All right, our next three here, they all require energy. Our first three were like water flowing down a hill, no energy needed. Our last three are active transport. They all need energy in the form of ATP. In our first one, we can easily see why that is. We're taking something and moving it from low concentration towards high concentration. So that's kind of like taking water and forcing up a hill. You'd have to use some type of pump. And in this case, we're using a protein pump. Here's a protein pump in action. You can see it's taking the particles from low concentration, moving them across the membrane towards the high concentration. The only way the pump works is by adding ATP to the situation. The most famous one is called the sodium-potassium pump, where sodium, here the yellow particles, move out of the cell and the potassium moves in, and that movement is all generated by ATP. Our final two are moving from high to low concentration, but they require energy because they're moving what we call macromolecules. The word macro means big or large, so it takes lots of energy to move them across the membrane. So our first one is we're moving this macromolecule into the cell. So when you move something into the cell that's very large, that's called endocytosis. The term endo, means in. Here we see endocytosis at work. The plasma membrane is actually wrapping around those particles. They form a vesicle. Our final one is similar but opposite. We're taking the macromolecule and moving it out of the cell. That is called exocytosis. You know that the term exo means exit or out. So here we can see exocytosis at work. The vesicle is actually joining up with the membrane. All right, guys, so if you had any trouble with these, you want to make sure you rewatch this video. You should be able to kind of go through this chart by yourself without me. So make sure you can handle that and watch this several times.